Welcome back, guys, and welcome to the first episode of the Wolfpack podcast. I am joined today by Mr. Flexelsson and Mr. Bailey.
Hello.
Hello.
And today we will be discussing matchmaking and BRs in War Thunder. So, our first talking point of the podcast is just a brief overview of kind of the state of the matchmaking in War Thunder currently, and what are our issues with it, and what do we think needs improving. So I'll let you start, Flex.
Does all of it count? That needs changing? No.
I mean, you're not wrong.
Some of the Russian and some of the higher tier stuff definitely needs changing. Mainly the Russians, but that's only because so many people play the Russian tanks that they kind of need to compress them for the demand to be met. So, but still, that needs changing. The Leopard probably should be a 9.0. Some of the Russian heavy tanks like the IS-3 especially should definitely go up. It's already been moved up, but it should go up even more because it can still see the Tiger 2 or even lower tanks if they're really unlucky. So that's not fun. And that's really it for now. Bailey?
For me, it's more a case of compression at. Well, there's two areas which are really compressed, and that's Tier 1 and Tier 5. Tier 1 doesn't really matter because progression through it is so quick.
Exactly.
But in Tier 5, for higher tier tanks, and particularly for jets, it's just far too close with. I mean, if you go to the British, you have an aircraft that entered service in I believe it was the end of 1944, beginning of 1945 for the Mark III, and it's facing Korean War jets, and
yeah,
they're just too compressed together, which is actually driving people away from it. I think.
I think that is exactly what's happening.
Oh yeah, I mean, and for me,
British high tier. So.
Yeah, and for me, my biggest issues with, I mean, like it's been mentioned, like BR compression, is such a huge issue with this game. Really everywhere. I mean, because you have, I mean, for example, with tanks, you have Tiger 2s going up and fighting T-54s and Conquerors and post-war tanks like this that never in history did they ever fight. Which
it's not very fun.
No, and then there's the same thing on the plane spectrum where you have planes like the late Fokker Wolves that were designed, in the 40s, the late 40s, or the late ends of the war, so 1944, 1945, going up against some jets that were designed in the 50s. And even some 50s jets going up against Korean, going up against 60s jets. So it's just BR compression everywhere. And this kind of leads me into the next talking point of what is your ideal matchmaking system for War Thunder? There's, as everyone knows, there's a lot of speculation on what matchmaking system is the best. And, I mean, currently we're in the BR system with an 8.0 max, 9.0 in jets. But earlier in the days of War Thunder, there was a 20-tier system, which had its many issues. But and then there's other types of matchmaking systems, like 10-tier systems, like you see in the wargaming areas. But and then there's also the discussion of should there just be flat-out historical matchmaking based purely on the introductory dates of the vehicles. So I'll let you start this one, Bailey.
For me, I don't. The current system could work, but it needs to be over a wider range. Currently, it's just too narrow for the amount of vehicles that we have in game, and as such, there is several BRs where there is a lot of vehicles, and they will just suck in all the vehicles around them, and you need to expand those out. I mean, instead of having a max of 8.0 in tanks and 9.0 in jets, it should be probably 10.0 for jets and for aircraft and 9.0 for tanks, and that would allow Gaijin to have much more flexibility and would probably alleviate quite a number of the compression problems that we have. I don't really see them wanting to do that without a lot of pressure put on them by the community.
Yeah, but
even with pressure.
Yeah, there isn't. They're saying they listen to the community, but really they don't. Sure, they did the Master of Russian bias bullshit, but that's because they know that the Russian stuff is biased. I mean, for example, this next patch they're getting an anti-tank guided missile
I believe
vehicle.
they've stated that. I believe if in Q&A that they did today, I believe it was in Russian, but in the translation, the Tilder translation that I have seen, they are going to release an anti-tank
Okay.
guided missile for all nations at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty sure that was confirmed. I'm pretty sure the Americans are getting the M551 Sheridan,
Okay.
and then the Germans should be getting the MBT-70. And the British one's a little bit of a tricky spot because officially the first British ATGM tank was designed in 1970. The missile itself was designed in 1968, but it wasn't put on the tank chassis until 1970.
I think the other problem is
could be
that
an issue.
the anti-tank missile is a lot more powerful than the other ones, the swing fire, because it can veer up to 90 degrees compared to other ones which don't nearly have as much maneuverability. I think the
Definitely.
one that I've seen, I think the one that I've seen fitted about the most is the ferret.
Oh yeah, I forgot about the ferret. All right, and so I guess my thoughts. I've always been in favor of raising the max BR, even when it was 8.0 to begin with. I mean, and we've seen it fluctuate so much. I mean, it was dropped down to 7.7 max for a long time, and that was horrible. I mean, because that's when you saw Leopards and T10s fighting against 6.7 tanks like Tiger 2s
Yeah,
and
that wasn't a
IS2s,
very
and
fun
that was
period at
no
all.
fun. But
That was very, very shit.
oh, that was yeah, and I'm glad they reverted that finally. But they only partially reverted it because now we only have
Yeah.
like what 5 8.0 tanks total, if
Yeah,
that.
and we can still see IS3s. I still see IS3s regularly.
Yeah.
I about the one thing, IS3, the IS3 is a difficult one for them to tier, because if it faces 8.0 tanks, it is definitely not an
It's
overpowered
horrible.
tank. Against 8.0 tanks with heat FS, it gets slaughtered. But it's so powerful when it's facing a down tier. It's a very difficult one for them to tier with the current compression. It would be
Definitely.
much if the BR system was expanded. It would allow tanks like this, which tiered a lot more fairly than currently, because you'd be facing less of the extremes.
Mm-hmm. And like the IS-3 is kind of a special case on its own just because of its date. I mean, technically speaking, it is still a World War II tank. It was developed in 1945, before the war had ended. Um, so technically speaking, I mean, even though it never saw combat, there's a lot of vehicles in this game that never saw combat, and if it had, it would have been seeing Tiger 2s. Um,
Oh yeah, definitely.
and so there's that issue, but at the same time, it probably would have continued service beyond the war. So to me, I've always been in favor, especially if Gaijin is like planning on implementing more post-war tanks. I mean, because there's always like the speculation of, oh, are they going to implement the T-55 or the T-62 for the Russians? Because as we know, Gaijin set their limit on we're not going to go past 1969. And the T-55 and the T-62 both fall into that spectrum. Both were developed
Yeah.
in the 60s. And so it begs the
Well,
question
late
of if you're
50s.
going to be and it begs the question of if you're going to be implementing these, where is that going to take you with the BR system? Because if you're not going to expand it, that's going to make it even worse. So to me, I feel like 9.0 is a good place to start for tanks, and then eventually, if they do add more post-war tanks, expanding it to 10.0 would be even better. Because you don't want to compress all the World War II vehicles with the Cold War vehicles, but you want to leave enough expansion so that even the Cold War vehicles aren't compressed on their own. Because a T-62 versus an early Cold War vehicle would not be a fair fight.
I know technically, if you go by historical standpoints, a T-62 should be facing a Centurion Mark 10, but it shouldn't really be facing. Well, it should only really be facing a Mark 10 if the Mark 10's been given a full up tier.
Yeah.
It should be facing the Chieftain, because the Chieftain came out, I believe, just shortly after the T62 entered service.
Yeah.
Because it was the T64 was developed immediately after the T62 because the Chieftain came into service. But if I just hope the early T62s couldn't traverse the turret while they were reloading the gun, which would be interesting to see if Gaijin introduced that feature into the game.
I don't think they would.
Probably not.
After all, it's just a game, so they need to kind of make it fair for people.
I mean, the one thing I do like with Gaijin is they're trying to make this a much more historical game, like more realistic than World of Tanks, for instance. But at the same time, there is a point at which you need to look at too much realism, because there is a point where too much realism becomes unenjoyable.
Unless there's that niche community that really enjoys it, but that's only not even a tenth probably of the actual War Thunder community. Like even the sim players wouldn't want that much. Like,
because I know historically, T62 wasn't really superior to the T55 due to its being much more unreliable, and there not being that much of a difference between the guns. As well as the case ejector, there was several problems with that as well, with it ejecting cases far too quickly and eventually breaking bones. But these are features that can't really be introduced into the game.
No. And so we've already kind of touched on this, just discussing this, but let's move into now different BRs that we need, like specifics that we need that are definitely, they need to be fixed. So let's start with planes, and we can start with the US tree. What special case planes are there that are definitely in need of BR changes, whether they need to be up tiered or down tiered?
Well, this isn't particularly a massive one, but the P47 in arcade battles is a 2.3, I believe.
The P47?
Yeah, I think
it is. Let me see what it is in arcade.
It's a 3.0 for the Americans. It is.
Yeah, 3.0.
It's 2.7 for the Germans in arcade.
That's it. Yeah, it's still really low.
Well, and part of that I feel, and that's a huge problem with just premiums in general, because if you think about it, premium planes are a great way for players who don't feel like grinding to get some higher tier planes that they can just take out and enjoy. But because of that, you have a very high influx of new players buying them who are not good at the game. Therefore, since the BRs in this game are based purely upon player performance with that vehicle, you're going to naturally see the premium planes having lower BRs than their standard counterparts. I mean, if you look at the like the P38, for example, the P38G, the premium one is 3.0 in arcade, whereas the standard one is 3.7.
I believe probably the reason for the German P47 being a lower BR in arcade is due to lacking ground ordnance.
That too.
But it's still a far too low BR. I think it's probably based on is that some people try and turn fights with it in arcade. That's what I can think. That's the only explanation I can think of. Because pretty much every aircraft in arcade you can turn fight.
Yeah.
That's arcade.
And I've even heard
all the flight models are very similar.
I mean, there's plenty of arguments with the American P47s that they even need to be up tiered in realistic, especially for tanks. Because if you look at them, they've got quite the bomb loadout. You've got 2 1,000 pounders, a 500 pounder, and then the 10 HFARs, which is quite the formidable bomb loadout, especially for being 3.7, where you're going to be seeing a lot of fairly low tanks.
But on that note, on tanks, the Russian T-34s. For example, I'm playing a game right now in Battalion 1, H1, and I've probably been up-tiered right now as well. But the T-34-85s, they can pen me at pretty much any angle and any range with the APCR shells or the magic shells that they don't even get.
The nuke shells, yeah.
Because, I can bounce off of their fucking front plate, which I shouldn't do. And they can just pen me at any right angle. So there is also that aspect that needs to be changed. Not just bad writing, but just some of the ammunition types of some of the countries just isn't fair. I know they bought the shell in for Russians to make them able to pen stuff, but there's no skill involved if you can pen anything at any range without having to think about it, you know?
Hmm. And that kind of begs the question, like the T-34s have always been such a highly scrutinized tank because, I mean, there's always the Russian bias bullshit calls that people make. And then
Yeah.
there's also the fact that you have to look at the tank's historical stats as well. This tank has been buffed above historical accuracy because
Oh,
in
definitely.
real life, the T-34, like for instance, the 1942 variant, at maximum performance with a full crew that are at like really high morale, they can
Yeah.
probably get 6 rounds per minute out of a T-34
Not the
1942.
almost 11 they get in this
And
game.
Yeah.
here's one that I do know. The Chieftain Mark III it was designed to fire 10 rounds a minute for the first. It was either the first minute or the first 5 minutes, and
First
then it
minute.
was first minute, and it was 6 rounds after that. And they've
Yeah.
currently gone for the 6 rounds. So basically, they're saying is, we'll play that you get the Chieftain with a knackered crew, and
Well, it still
that's the stock
outperforms
reload
any
time.
other gun in the game in terms of reloads for that tier and that size. So you shouldn't really be complaining about that, to be honest. It
No.
still outperforms any other 120mm gun in the game.
But you
But
also have to look at
I do feel real. I think Gaijin use reload rate as sort of like a soft way to try and balance tanks.
and
Right.
to that effect, they're right. It is a much softer way of balancing tanks, but I think it's also kind of an aspect of laziness because really what you could do is if you weren't so obsessed with keeping your BRs compressed, is you could do like if you had a 9.0 system, you could do much more slight implement like much more slight changes in the BRs of a tank, like because right now a point 0.3 BR change up or down is actually very significant. But if you had a 9 or a 10.0 BR system, then a point 0.3 change wouldn't be that much, but it would still be enough to kind of sway that balance a little bit more without completely breaking the tank or completely making the tank useless.
Yep. Wait, do
For
American
example, I'm
tanks?
facing a Sherman Jumbo, and I can't pen his upper plate with a German 88mm.
That's
Well,
actually how
that's
those
because
tanks were designed, though.
Yes.
yeah.
And this is a perfect example of a tank that is well tiered.
Yes.
And you need a bit of, and he's actually just killed me. But this is a 76mm one as well, so he's penning me. But a tank like that, people say is overpowered. No, 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 no. You just need to think. You can't hit him head on because you can't pen him.
No.
Go around, be tactical, you know. But
Yeah.
that's exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem you'll
I
find
have
with
No good
any
example
game,
of that
though.
there.
And
I
you'll
I
find that problem with any game where people will cry OP just because they don't know it's a new tank that they haven't seen
Exactly.
before,
I
or
get
they just don't know how to counter it.
I get a lot of people saying that to me when I drive my Black Prince. Now, if you have the Black Prince, you know it's not overpowered. You
Mm-mm.
about 9 games out of 10, you will be facing an up tier where you'll be against 6.7 and 7.0 German tanks, Tiger Henschels and King Tigers, and those they can easily pen you through your frontal armor. You're a very slow, very immobile tank, and that's what you have to rely on is your armor. And if you face a full up tier like that, your armor is not worth anything.
And the other thing
Pretty
with
much
the
when it
the
Black
does.
exact same
Prince,
at tier 5.
oh yeah, and the other thing with the Black Prince is when you do get those full up tiers, that 17 pounder suddenly doesn't hold up very well anymore because
No,
even with
I
that
mean yes,
APBS,
you
you're
can
still
you
not going to be
can
able to pen the front of a Tiger very easily.
you can pen through their
Mm.
Well,
turrets
Tiger
dead
2.
easily. You can pen through their turrets, but it's you're really relying on getting shots into their side to hit their ammo racks to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, when it faces a full down tier, it's very difficult for even the Tiger 1 to pen it through its frontal armor because it is extraordinarily thick. But no, it's not an overpowered tank, and that's the thing because it's dragged up to 6.7 because so many people are playing 6.7 tanks. And that is because battle rating is so compressed around late tier 4, tier 5 that it just sucks. That tanks that shouldn't be facing them are just sucked in anyway.
And I would say there's probably another issue with late tier 4 and tier 5 is that you have to look at the proportionality of players and where they're distributed. Most players are going to be probably around tier 1 and tier 2 because as you progress through the game, more and more people will quit because they either don't like the grind, they get bored of the game, or something about the game pisses them off. So as you go through the later tiers, you're going to have less and less people playing, which only furthers the compression issue.
Precisely. And this is the issue basically in the entire game. There's not enough players, so they have to compress it. Especially the top tier, because and it sucks.
Yeah, and that's like the classic slippery slope of we don't have enough players, so we need to compress the BRs to make people get games. But that's only going to create more player dissatisfaction, therefore more players leave, and therefore more compression. So it's just an endless, vicious, repeating cycle.
We move on to Germany now from America.
Yeah.
I know we
so we'll move on to there. So we'll move on to some German planes on what we think need to have some BR changes. I'll start it off really quick with a very special case, the Horton. The Horton has also been under a lot of scrutiny because of how it plays in Air RB versus Tank RB. Because as people know, in Tank RB, the reason this plane got an up tier to 8.0 a while back was because of how well it was performing in Tank RB, because it's got those 30 mils that have HVAP rounds. And any tank at 8.0, aside from like the mouse, but the Horton's not going to fight the mouse, from top down, it's going to be able to punch straight through them. And so that led to the BR being increased, but then that led out to the lashing out of the Air RB community, where the Horton was now fighting MiG-17s and Sabres, which definitely it should not be fighting, because it is, I mean, while it was never actually built, it would have been considered a still World War II jet.
Okay.
And so that begs the question of, should there be a separate BR for Tank RB versus Air RB for planes?
For me, I tend to play probably more air realistic than tank realistic. The Horton isn't a 7.0 jet, but neither is it an 8.0 jet. It should lie at 7.3 or 7.7. Why I say that? Because its performance is very, very comparable to other 8.0 jets. At 7.0, I take out a Tempest Mark II, as I mainly play British. I don't have a 7.0 jet, but that's another issue. The Horton tends to perform very, very well against the P80 and the F84. It can both outrun and outturn the P80, and it can outturn the F84. It can end the matches on its own by destroying ground targets, and in the hands of a capable pilot, the Horton is untouchable. It should really be about 7.7, where it would be facing 8.0, where it would be facing more 8.0s, yes. But it's got comparable performance to aircraft like the Attacker, the Banshee. If they're faster, it can outturn them. Its top speeds are pretty much similar to a lot of other 8.0 jets. It's not an 8.0 because it should not be facing the top tier jets. It's not as good as them. That's my opinion.
Anything to add, Flex?
No, he summed it up perfectly.
All right. This might be just me, but I've always I mean, in this can definitely be argued, but there's definitely a lot of wiggle room with the argument on the Stukas, because there are some Stukas that are very, very low in the BRs, especially like if you look at the Stuka, the G series that are 2.7 and 2.3 respectively in realistic, and those things have some pretty deadly guns with those HVAP rounds on those twin 37s. Those can do some serious damage to tanks. But at the same time, in Air RB, those 37s are only effective in the hands of a skilled pilot against other planes. So that's another plane that's kind of touchy, because you don't want to up tier them too much, because they really shouldn't be facing late tier props but they shouldn't be raffle stomping early tier ground forces either.
There definitely should be a different BR for air realistic and tank realistic. There wouldn't be a change in BR for many aircraft, but for a few examples like Stuka and the Horton, yes. Well, and here's one thing that it's not a change to any BR, but it's rather a change of line. Currently, if you look at the German tech tree, you can get a 9.0 jet, the MiG-15 bis, just after researching the Heinkel 162. This is the least amount of RP you can get to a 9.0 jet researching through tier 5. I know you can get a 9.0 jet with your second aircraft in Britain, but it's less RP here. Now, I think the ME-163 should be moved to after the Heinkel 162 to give you an extra aircraft before getting to the MiG-15 bis. I know a lot of German pilots seem to almost like skip over the 162 and they just start taking out the MiG-15 bis. And playing against German MiG-15 pilots compared to Russian MiG-15 pilots, the German MiG-15 pilots tend to be not as good, just from experience, because they haven't played as much jet combat as the Russian MiG-15 pilots. That's why I think if you added in the the Comet after the 162, you would create that extra buffer where the German pilots would be playing more top-tier jet combat before they got to a 9.0 jet.
Definitely. And that also kind of kills two birds with one stone, because not only are you increasing that grind to get the MiG-15 bis, but you're also decreasing the grind to get to the later ME-262s and the Sabre with the Germans. Because you have to go through it's 5 jets, including the Sabre, in that line. And then the MiG-15 is 2 jets. So that would kind of balance that out a little bit more. And then Flex, if you don't have anything, we can move on to German tanks.
I can do German tanks, yep.
Alright. So, do either of you want to start anything off with the German tanks?
The Leopard.
Yes.
Everyone thinks it's overpowered, some think it's not, some think it is, blah yada yada. What are your opinions? Personally, I don't think it is, but the heat shells at high tier should definitely be removed, or at least the actual, real life physics implemented.
Should be
right
modeled.
now it's exactly as it says, 400 mil, whatever, at any range, at any angle.
Yeah.
Which it isn't true, because
it's not true at all.
Heat really works best at complete 90-degree angles.
Mm-hmm. And the penetration values are already listed. That's what it should be, but it's not. Exactly. And heat also, and even normal heat, not just heat FS, also isn't properly modeled in this game in that it completely ignores spaced armor.
Exactly.
And I could have brought this up with the US tanks, but the super Pershing right now is basically useless because its spaced armor isn't working properly. Because you can get up tier to see 7.7 tanks, and there are 7.7 tanks that have fin stabilized heat. The Jagdpanzer 4.5 has fin stabilized heat. The Su-122-54 and the T-54 have fin stabilized heat, and they're 7.7. And so when you're going up against tanks like that, the Super Pershing was so good in real life because hardly anything could pen it frontally. And you don't see that in this game, where someone can just take a T-54, point and click at your tank, and it's going to go through no matter where you shoot. And so, regarding the Leopard, I personally don't think it's overpowered. I will say it is the best tank in 8.0 right now, because it is probably the easiest one to use, just because of how fin stabilized heat works. But I don't necessarily think it's overpowered, because it can be killed by just about anything. Mm-hmm. You could take 20 mils to it and kill it.
Exactly.
And it's really all just a game, and like this is how high tier works now because of instabilized seed. It's just a game of who sees who first. If you see
Pretty
the
much.
leopard first, that leopard's dead. If the leopard sees you first, you're dead.
Pretty much.
I think about the only tank that has any chance of surviving Heat FS is the Chieftain, and even then it has to get lucky.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
So another one, I guess if that wraps up the leopard, another one I think definitely needs a BR raise is the Dicker Max.
Yes.
And while I do agree that tank destroyers should be threatening, and the Dicker Max definitely fits that category, it's just too threatening. Sitting at 4.3 right now, it is one-shotting really anything it comes across, whether it gets up-tiered or down-tiered.
4.7 would be better. 4.7.
4.7 is definitely better. Because, I mean, if you look at the stock round, you have 144 millimeters of pen at the most, and a hell of a lot of explosive power, an equivalent of 343 grams of TNT. That's a lot. And when you get down-tiered, which happens quite often in the Dicker Max, you're facing things like Cromwells and Shermans, 75 Shermans, which don't have a lot of armor. And so even with that stock round, you're going to be able to punch straight through them and one-shot the tank almost every time. And then once you unlock the upgraded round, you have 202 millimeters of pen at the most, with slightly less explosive power, but it's still more than enough to one-shot any tank you come across. And so it definitely needs an up tier to me. I would say 4.7 would be a good place for it, because it's going to take a lot of weaker tanks out of the picture when it gets down tiered, and then it'll put some more threatening tanks into the picture when it gets up tiered. Because if you put it up at 4.7, now it can start facing things like the IS-1. It can start facing the Challenger, although that's not really terribly threatening. Well, I mean, anything's threatening to the Dicker Max just because it doesn't have very much armor. But you'll definitely start putting some more beefy tanks against it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Alright, anything else with Germany?
Well, the fact that they need more post-war tanks, because
and that's kind of a different topic on its own, because if you look at the German post-war tanks, there weren't very many, and especially there weren't very many pre-1970. I mean, because right now, the only tank that would really make a difference for the Germans would be the Leopard 1A1, which was developed in 1969.
There's also one other one the Europanzer, which was a collaboration between France, Germany, and Italy. And though it didn't go into service because, well, the Italians didn't want it, the Germans didn't want it, and the French didn't want it. The French thought it was too well armored. The Germans didn't think it was well armored enough and was too slow. They did develop it into the Leopard. So that would be a potential fit in between the Panther 2 and the Leopard 1, probably at about 7.7 on the current battle rating system.
Definitely. And so, I mean, I'm definitely a proponent of adding the Leopard 1A1, which would come after the Leopard 1 in this tech tree, and you'd have to expand your BRs, but if you put it like into a 9.0 BR system, it would definitely be the 9.0, with the Leopard 1 being 8.7 or 8.3. Because, I mean, the Leopard 1 and the Leopard 1A1 aren't terribly different, but the Leopard 1A1, I believe, was slightly better off with pretty much everything. Speed, armor, and the gun, even though the armor doesn't make really any difference at all. Alright. So now we can move on to Russia. Any screaming cases that isn't the entire tech tree that definitely need BR changes?
T-3485s.
I can definitely agree with that one. Yeah, the T-3485 is a very, very powerful tank. I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to down tier it to 5.3 because it was perfectly fine at 5.7. Um, but Gaijin being Gaijin. Um, but there's also the T-34-85D5T, which I think is a tank a lot of people overlook. Because if you look at this tank and you look at the cannon, it's got the same cannon as the IS-1. And the IS-1 is at 5.7. I mean, granted, the IS-1 has more armor and is slower, but the T-34-85D5T definitely should not be a 5.0 tank.
I just think
No,
it should be.
it should be a 5.7 at least.
I think probably 5.3 and 5.7 because if I remember, the D5T doesn't get the APCR; it just gets.
No, it just gets the nuke round, the APHE, and then the HE.
Yeah, that thing's monstrous. Jesus Christ, 164 grams.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing, is that current meta of the game seems to favour shells with HE filler a lot more than solid shots.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean,
in fact, it gets 100 grams more than the German 88mm. What?
Perhaps Gaijin could do some soft balancing in that they reduce the amount of fragmentation caused by HE filler, or they should perhaps try and model into the fact that you're going to get a shockwave from APDS and increase the spalling. And it would also help if they actually put in the historical values for the pin of things like the British 17-pounder APDS.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I don't think they necessarily need to nerf the HE filler in this game. I think they really need to buff AP solid shot because it does not have nearly enough spalling, and typically whatever spalling you do get is typically eaten up by whatever you hit. So if you hit the cannon breach, all that spalling is eaten up by the cannon breach. If you hit an ammo rack and it doesn't detonate, which is a fairly commonplace thing, the ammo rack eats up all the spalling, so you don't get any collateral damage aside from whatever thing you hit.
Yeah, that kind of sucks.
Mm-hmm. And so, obviously, the other two big issues right now in the two high tier issues right now with the Russians are the T-54 1947 and the IS-3. Me personally, the T-54 needs to be raised 7.7 like the rest, because while it doesn't get the APDS and the Heat FS that the other two get, I mean, only the 1951 gets the Heat FS, but it doesn't get those extra rounds, but at the same time, it does have better armor, at least on the hull. Its front plate's actually thicker than the other two. And every time I take out my T-54 1947 into a game and I get down tiered, I feel bad. Because a T-54 should never be fighting like a Tiger 2P or a what other 6.3 tanks are there? A M36 Jackson shouldn't be fighting things like that.
One thing is, for the aviation for Russia, there's two aircraft that stand out: the Yak-3P and the MiG-17.
Definitely.
The Yak-3P is still one of the strongest aircraft when it gets given a full up tier to 5.7. I know some people in our clan want it removed entirely from the game, but I disagree with that. I think it needs an up tier, and the problem is with the Yak-3P is if you've seen mags on it, there isn't a lot of evidence on what its combat capabilities are.
But Mags is also full of himself, so yeah,
Yes. But that's the thing, because the Yak-3P never saw combat. There's data on it, but there's not data on it in English. It's only in Russian, which, well, I don't think any of us here can read it.
No.
Yeah.
And the other problem is the MiG-17, which
it wasn't needed.
That's probably.
I mean,
it wasn't. It's.
If it were to be
It's
added, it needed
ridiculously
to be added with planes from the other countries that match it.
yes.
Because if you look
Yeah.
back, the Saber, the Hunter, and the MiG-15, they were all fairly balanced with each other. And then they added
Yes.
the MiG-17 in, which again threw the balance out of proportion, and now high-tier jet matchmaking favors the MiG-17 because it is a much later designed plane than any of the other jets in this game, as well as has a lot higher performance.
Yeah. What I think what they need to introduce to balance it out is another variant of the MiG-17, actually, the MiG-17F, which is a higher top speed. But to counterbalance that for the Americans, you're going to get the F3F Demon, which would be on the naval tech tree. And for Britain, you would have the Gloucester Javelin and possibly the Supermarine Scimitar or Swift. These are all contemporary aircraft at around about the same top speed and balance each other out. The Americans should definitely not get the Super Sabre because that is a supersonic aircraft.
No.
And I know they've stated they're not going to introduce supersonic aircraft.
And I'm glad about that.
But just introducing the MiG-17 on its own was a mistake.
Oh yeah,
Definitely.
That thing can hit supersonic speeds, right?
Yeah, if you get going in a fast enough dive, you can break the sound barrier with the MiG-17. I mean, it's not the only plane in the game that can do that, but it's one of the few that can do it without ripping its wings.
Yeah.
Britain?
Yeah, let's move on to Britain.
Meteor Mark 3 does not need to be an 8.0. Let's start off with that.
Yeah.
No,
We're
not
talking
at all.
not even a jet that was that first flew in 1945. It first flew in 1944. This should be the counter to the Messerschmitt 262. I mean, who does not want to fly like the only Allied World War II jet against the classic German World War II jet?
Yep.
And that isn't War Thunder this is about. I mean, I know the Sea Meteor. There's even an argument for decreasing it because it's the same airframe. Okay, it's got more powerful engines, but the rip speed's still the same. You can rip your wings flying in a straight line in that aircraft.
Definitely. I mean, I personally don't have either of them, but from gameplay I've seen and like from just comparing them to historical, I mean, if you look, I mean, this Meteor Mark III, it can be outsped by a lot of late war props.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
I mean, because it's like at stock, its top speed is 755 kilometers per hour. You look at things like the Dornier 335 that was recently added, that easily outspeeds it. The
Meteor
Seafires.
Spaded, the Meteor Mark III is the same top speed as a spaded Yak jet. Yeah, it's not even. It's 8.0 compared to their 6.7.
Yep. I'm definitely all for lowering the Meteor Mark III to 6.7.
I would say 7.0. And then you've also got the Vampire. The first prototype of the Vampire flew in 1943, and it entered service just too late to see active service in the war. But it was like summer of 1945 it went into active service. This thing was it is an aircraft that should probably also feature a down tier to 7.0 because it has a very, very poor acceleration. Yes, it's extremely maneuverable, but it's got a climb rate worse than most tier 4 props.
There's also another issue with the Vampire that I know you've brought up many times before, Bailey, but it can't actually take off if you have ground ordnance on it, the two 1,000-pound bombs. If you try to take off from an airfield with those, it will not get off the ground.
And one other aircraft, a very recent introduction, the Sea Venom. Now, this is a top tier jet that Okay, it can outmaneuver a MiG-15 just. It relies on the MiG-15 approaching its speeds over 400 miles an hour for it to be able to turn inside it convincingly. But the problem is getting to 400 miles an hour. It bleeds speed like, and once you get to 400 miles an hour and turn, it bleeds speed like there's no tomorrow. Banshees out accelerate it, and to be perfectly honest, it is better, and its 8.0s are competitive against it. It is not a good aircraft and should be down tiered to 8.0. But it should really be an 8.3, but that's because Gaijin don't want to have jets in between 8.0, 9.0, and 7.0 for some bloody reason.
Yeah, that I've never understood why they don't do that, because they do it with tanks. I mean, they didn't used to. They didn't used to have 7.3 tanks at all. Now they finally did do that, but I don't know why they won't do it with planes, because there really is a lot of variation between a lot of these planes. Because if you look at like a country that actually has not just 8.0 and 9.0 like Britain, but if you look at something like Germany, where you have all the different BRs of jets, where you've got your HE-162 that's 6.7, you've got your ME-262 which is 7.0, and then it just goes to 8.0 with the next 262, and then to 9.0 with the Sabre. Even though there is differences between the three ME-262s in that line, but they're not nearly enough of a difference to warrant a whole 1.0 BR difference.
Or you go to Britain where you've got 4 Meteors.
That are all the exact same BR.
All 8.0. Yeah.
Other than jets, though, the British air tree is definitely, I would say, very well balanced. There's really nothing else in that tree that really screams out that this needs to be up tiered or this needs to be down tiered.
Bullfighters.
To some degree.
Yeah, bullfighters need to be down tiered, particularly the Mark 21. You never really see people fly
I did
them,
forget
though.
that was 5.0. Oh, goodness.
Yeah. They're over tiered, and you hardly see anyone fly them at all.
Yeah, I mean, the Mark 6,
Well,
I would say,
they're
is fine
great
at 3.0, but
they're great planes, and if you use them right, you can do really, really well. But like you said, definitely up tiered, not too high tiered.
wow, that Beaufighter Mark 21 is higher than both of the Mosquitoes.
Yes.
Alright, and then British tanks.
If we ignore the repair costs in Tier 4, and actually, well, let's be honest, throughout most of the tree, you've got the problem with the Mark III and the Carnarvon. Practically the same tank apart from armor. Yet with the same BR. The Mark III does get a lot less hull armor compared to the Carnarvon. Does it deserve to be the same BR?
I would argue yes.
Yes.
I mean, because if you compare the Centurion Mark III with the Carnarvon, the Carnarvon's better with the armor, but at the same time, the Centurion Mark III is a smaller tank.
I do agree. It's a good 6.7 tank.
Mm-hmm. But the problem with those two tanks lies with the repair costs. I mean, the Carnarvon, spaded, has a 12,000 credit repair cost. That's higher than any other tank in the game. And then the Centurion Mark III has a 7,000 credit repair cost, which is, I also believe, higher than pretty much every other tank in the game.
I think it's the second highest in the game.
Yeah. Second to the Carnarvon. So, I mean, and like, I remember grinding with my Carnarvon to get the Chieftain. I would be losing money in games where you should never be losing money. I would be getting 3 kills in a game, then dying in the Carnarvon, and then I would lose money because of that. Which is, I mean, and they did it because when the Carnarvon and the Centurion were introduced, they were 6.3, which definitely they shouldn't have been. But their solution to that at the time was increase the repair cost, which, I mean, sure, that's an okay way to balance it, but it's not going to change anything. People are still going to use the tank. The only thing that's going to change is instead of making money with using those tanks, people are either going to come out even or lose money. But it didn't really discourage anyone from playing them. And so when they raised them up to 6.7, I'm pretty sure Gaijin forgot to reduce their repair costs again. Because they definitely shouldn't be that high. I mean, you look at the Carnarvon with its 12,000 credit repair cost, and you look at the Conqueror, which is in every way more complex. It's bigger, it's got a bigger gun, and it would cost in real life a lot more to repair it, but it's a third of the repair cost, essentially.
Oh, here's one tank. That's battle rating is interesting. The Matilda Mark II.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
That tank is atrocious.
Well, when given a full down tier, it clubs. When it gets given whenever it gets given even a slight, not even a full up tier, an up tier to like 3.7, it gets clubs.
Yep. I mean, because its armor is pretty good, but it's slow, very, very slow, and its gun is very lacking for being at 3.0.
It's a tank that heyday was 1940, 1941. It's tiered to face against tanks that are 1942, 1943.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at it, that thing's facing Panzer IV F2s, with only a very slight up tier, and even, and then it's fighting T-34s with the 76s, with an up tier to 3.7.
And it will be because Britain only faces against apart from once in a blue moon, and when I mean it's like once every 500 matches, you'll be facing against Americans. You face either Russians and Germans or just Germans. You're fighting based on their BR, which is 3.3 or 3.7, 4.0.
Yeah. I mean, there are very few 3.0 tanks in the German tree and in the Soviet tree. It's mostly 2.7 or 3.7, with like a couple 3.3s scattered. I mean, because the first T-34 is a 3.3, but I'm pretty sure that's like the only 3.3 in the Russian tree. Oh no, Su-122. But yeah, the Matilda definitely needs its BR dropped, I think. But I think, I mean, even dropping it, it's going to start seeing tanks that it'll club even harder than the ones it clubs now when you get down tiered.
Perfectly honest, the solution for the Matilda is to prevent it facing a full up tier.
Just limit it to seeing 3.7 only.
Yes.
Alright. And another tank I know that has come under some scrutiny is the Cromwell 5. Because, I mean, everyone knows the Cromwell was developed, it's a late war tank. It was developed in 1944? Or late 1943? And it's currently sitting at a 3.3 BR, which it performs well there, and I would argue it performs better than a lot of 3.3 tanks. Because it can certainly hold its own against T-34s, because it's got a good enough gun to be penning those T-34s pretty regularly. And its armor isn't, the armor's not the best, it's a box, but it's still a good tank, but it still begs the question, because it does do very well. And I've seen a lot of people complain about the tank being too good for its BR. But I'm pretty sure most of those people are under the impression of, hey, this is a 1943, 1944 tank, why is it facing 1941 and 1940 tanks?
It's a cruiser tank designed to be lightly armored, and gun is not designed for anti-tank combat, it's designed for being more anti-personnel.
Mm-hmm.
This tank is incredibly easy to one-shot due to where the ammo rack is stored, and due to it being very thinly armoured. It has what? 25 mil of armour on the side? I mean, 50 cals can claim that.
Actually, yeah, they might be able to. From close enough range.
Yep.
Yeah, it's 25 on the side of the hull. I mean, hell, it's got more rear armor than it has side armor.
Yeah. It relies on its fast reload rate, having decent pen, and being very quick. Because you know, if you drive the Cromwell, if you get hit once, you're either
down to 2
dead,
crew members and crippled
dead,
or dead.
Yes. There's no other way to put it.
Yep, so I guess we both agree the Cromwell is fine exactly where it is. Alright, and then I know nothing about the Japanese planes. I don't fly them, but we can...
I was just going to say one more thing about Britain. The Sherman Firefly and the Avenger. They should have APDS for the 17-pounder.
Yes.
And historically, and it wouldn't really be that overpowered, I don't think. Because both of them have got no armor for that BR. They get one-shotted.
Definitely. I mean, the Firefly, if you get down-tiered, its armor can hold up. But if you get up-tiered to the point where you're facing Tigers and like IS-1s, T-34-85s, you're going to get one-shotted.
You get up-tiered a lot because T-34-85s, Tigers, and Panthers are very commonly played. More than often get up-tiered to 5.7. That is where you need an APDS shell for the Firefly, which it would have historically used against Tigers.
Definitely. And I think, I mean, if you're going to put APDS on one tank only, the Avenger really needs it. Because the Avenger is supposed to be a highly mobile, very threatening tank destroyer. And it's at a 5.3 BR, sharing the same BR as the Comet, and it's got less armor than the Comet, and it's the same speed. But it's less threatening because it doesn't have APDS. And so you're stuck always fighting T-34-85s and pretty common and almost always fighting Tigers with only solid shot, APCBC or AP, which is very unreliable. Okay, Flex, do you have anything? I guess not. So, I know nothing about Japan, but Bailey, if you want to add anything that you know about any Japanese planes that need changes.
I'm into Tier 4 for Japan for their... And from what I can tell, the main problem with Japan is you've got 1 repair cost and 2 the A6M5s. They perform so inferiorly compared to aircraft that they face. I mean, their Horizon's 5.0, the Otsu's 5.3, and the Ko's 5.0. They commonly face, like, Griffin Spits begin at 5.3. If Bearcats are very commonly played, so you quite often get facing up against the first Bearcat.
Yeah.
Though not as commonly. Yes, the problem is Griffin Spits, and they cannot perform against Griffin Spits at all. Griffin Spits are over 100 miles an hour faster than them, they climb them easily, and as an A6M5 pilot, you have to rely on a Griffin Spitfire pilot being a complete and utter idiot to do anything. They should be, perfectly honest, they could be about 4.0. Because the aircraft designed to replace it, the A7, is 4.0.
Yep.
The A7's a lower tier, which is quite funny.
which the A7
Doesn't make any sense.
But that's what I'm saying. They're not 5.0s, they're 4.0s. I think the reason they got up tiered was simply because people still tried to turn with zeros. Don't try to turn with a 0. Anyway.
Yeah. I think you mentioned it, but repair costs with Japan, the R2Y2s, they have the highest repair costs in the game. The stock R2Y2 V1, it has a 21,000 credit repair cost. The V3 has a 50,000 credit repair cost. I mean, it's hard to make that kind of money, even in AirRB, where you do very well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, talking to the person in the squadron who plays a lot of Japanese, the R2Y2s are, yes, they have very good guns, but they're not as fast as the American jets, and they aren't as maneuverable as the American jets. They rely on, one, they get the air spawn because they're a jet bomber, which provides for them a huge advantage, and two, their guns. If you die in an R2Y2, you're losing money. And a lot of the time he says, American pilots seem to go head-on with an aircraft armed with 4 nose-mounted 30 mils. Why? If that's the reason they're going head-on with R2Y2s, then I don't know what to say. But it's just what I've heard from him. I haven't got them myself. I haven't played them.
Yeah, and then Flex, do you have anything to add with Japan? I don't know if you play it.
Apart from the fact that I agree with the repair costs. For example, my K84 stock is almost 20 grand. It's currently at 30,000 right now. Something like that. It's silly.
Oh, jeez.
Just for a repair.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, I think it's 20 grand for a repair. It's not fun.
Oh, is this the K84? Cool.
Yeah.
I think stock it's 28,000.
28,000.
28,000, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a 4.3 plane. Yeah. So yeah, Japan
silly.
and Britain with horrendous repair costs.
Clearly, we know who Gaijin doesn't like.
Yeah.
2 least played nations.
Alright, well...
Also, one thing before we move on is preparation for landing on Hokkaido. That shit shouldn't be done. Because the British planes easily outperform the American planes. Especially since most American fighters don't really know what they're doing.
What you're saying, I would say, is that British pilots outperform American pilots.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant.
I think that just comes with the territory, though, because a lot of the U.S. players who come into this game that are new, I mean, and I was this way when I first started the game, I was like, ooh, America, yeah. So I started playing American planes, and when American tanks came out, I started off with the American tanks, and I came to realize that that's not always a good thing, because a lot of I mean, I've noticed this with a lot of games I play, but American players in general, I mean, no offense to anyone out there, I mean, because I'm an American player myself, but it just seems to me that American players tend to not be as good, at least at the start, as, say, like European or Russian players. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's just the way it seems. And so since they're coming in to the Americans and starting off with them, that kind of puts the American teams at a disadvantage. I mean, that's why on the War Thunder forums there's a whole page, a thread that's called the U.S. teams are bad master thread, and it's at like 200 and something pages of discussion now.
I think also part of the other problem is that America doesn't have a non-premium fighter between 5.0 and just have bombers.
Yeah. All right. So, couple more things to cover in the podcast. The next one is kind of more along the lines of team balance. There's I can't remember when it was, but not too long ago, probably a few months ago, there was a patch released for tanks where there's supposed to be a cap on the highest BR tank. So if you're in let's say a 5.7 game, where 5.7 is the highest BR, there's only supposed to be 4 5.7 tanks per team.
Which bullshit,
which is bullshit because it never happens.
Tiger 2s.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a game in 5.7 with my Germans, for instance, and I'll be on a team, and I'll see maybe, like, I'm in a Tiger, and then there's maybe, like, one other person, like, in a Panther D or a Tiger. And then I'll look at the other team that's, like, all allies, and I'll see, 4 IS-1s, a lot of T-34-85s, and a lot of other 5.7 tanks with the other countries. And it's like, okay, how is this fair? We have 2 5.7 tanks, and they have 8. And so I mean, part of that stems from some countries don't even flat out have tanks of a specific BR, and if that match happens to be with that BR as the maximum, you won't have any tanks from that country at that BR, so you don't have any of the top tier.
This happens in aircraft too. I've got a couple of things that for this. I had a match yesterday, and I've had matches like this before, where the allied team consists entirely of 8.0 jets, and you're thinking, this is one of these rare cases where we're facing against just 8.0 jets, and no. Turns out half the Russian team is comprised of MiG-15s and MiG-17s. Which just infuriating. And the other one is playing British 6.3 props like the Tempest Mark II. Jet preparation for military landing on Hokkaido, and then you end up facing American jets without the British having any time to the American jets. And all you need is one competent jet pilot on the American team.
And it's over, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and quite a few of the American jets are very easy to play, especially the F-2H. The F-2H is basically...
Well, these jets that you're facing are the P-80 and the F-84 Thunderjet.
And both of which are...
well, relatively easy to play. Still.
Yeah.
You're only facing against props.
And this kind of leads into the question of what needs to change with the team balance. What needs to happen in order to make it balanced?
Yes, well, there is supposed to be qualitative matchmaker, but it isn't working. Fix it. That's the simple answer.
Or they're just saying there's one when there really isn't.
Well, there needs to be.
I mean, there was when it was first implemented. It was working, but it only lasted for probably a few weeks, and then it just went away. Another thing of team balance that I personally think needs to happen, it's quantitative in a different sense, and you'll see this a lot with American teams. You'll see a whole team
bombers
that'll be consistent of bombers. You'll see probably, if it's a 12v12, you'll see like 10 B-17s and 2 poor P-51s on that team. And that needs to be fixed. I mean, because, sure, bombing is a great way to get RP, but it kind of screws over your entire team if your team consists of bombers, because, sure, you might be able to rush out and get all the ground targets before the fighters can catch up with you, but the odds of that happening, especially when you only have 1 or 2 fighters on your team, is very slim, because those 1 or 2 fighters aren't going to be able to last too long against a team that has, 6 or 7 fighters. They're going to maybe get 1 kill between the 2 of them and then both get shot down, while the rest of the enemy team is going after your bombers. So, I mean, it's like, it would probably require a lot of testing to figure out, okay, how many bombers should be allowed per team, but there definitely needs to be some sort of quantitative matchmaking on, there needs to be a limit of this type of plane in the game.
There is a problem. I think part of that is due to where the B-17s lie on the American tech tree. They fall into Tier 3. Prize BR Fighter is, well, the 1C Corsair at 4.7. And that isn't an aircraft that you see very frequently. You seem... Personally, I think American players... People probably try, when they reach Tier 3, they'll unlock the B-17 and start taking it out because it's such a well-known aircraft and it's very easy to unlock.
Yeah. I mean, because you have to go get what? The PBY, the TBD, TBF, and the two B-25s. And then you can get yourself a B-17.
Next topic.
All right, just let's see. So one more little thing on team balance is special events. We recently had the World War II Chronicles events come up, and in that kind of reminded me of a different type of matchmaking that you really only see in these special events, which is, and it actually does have that quantitative matchmaking. In a lot of the ground events with World War II Chronicles, you would see that there would be a limit on the number of tanks of a certain type of tank. Like, for instance, there was an event where the German team had the Dicker Max on it, and the Soviet team had the Su-100 on it, the Su-100Y. And you could only take 2 Dicker Maxes per team and 1 Su-100Y per team. And it's it's a shame that you only see that type of matchmaking in special events. And so there's the question of, should that type of matchmaking that's only seen in special events be applied to normal games? And there's also the question of, with that same kind of matchmaking, you had to pay credits to take out that tank. And so do you think that's something that should continue in special events, or is that something that should be removed?
I thought it was actually a very good idea.
Yeah, and I think a similar system, obviously, without credits should be used in normal matchmaking, but as we've stated before, that clearly doesn't work, which is a shame because it leads to an entire team of leopards, for example, sometime, versus a mixed Russian and a British team with some late tier 4 tanks and some tier 5s and whatever else in between. It's not fair.
Mm-hmm. All right. And so the final thing I have isn't necessarily related to matchmaking directly, but more of map selection, and that is night battles. Me personally, I'm a huge fan of night battles, and I don't see them as often as I would like to. But I know a lot of people don't like them. And the question is, would you like to see the matchmaker put more heavy priority on distributing those night battles more frequently, or do you think it's fine the way it is?
I would like to see more night battles. I also like to see more battles where it's raining as well.
Flex?
Looks.
Night battles? Yeah, that's pretty cool.
All right, and that'll do it for the podcast. Thank you guys for watching.
No worries, man. Oh, never mind.
All right, and that'll do it. Thank you guys for watching this podcast. There will be more to come. Stay tuned. Have a nice day.